It is my pleasure to introduce Glenn Wharton, sculpture conservator at the Museum of Modern Art, specializing in time-based media. He's also a research scholar at New York University with a joint appointment at the Institute of Fine Arts Conservation Center and the Museum Studies Program. He serves as acting executive director of INCCA-NA, the North American group of the International Network for the Conservation of Contemporary Art. The graduate seminars he teaches at NYU include Issues in the Conservation of Modern and Contemporary Art, the Conservation of Modern Sculpture, and Museum Conservation in Contemporary Culture. Glenn began his conservation career as an archaeological and sculpture conservator in 1981. He worked as field conservator for the Sardis Expedition, the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, and the Princeton Cyprus Expedition at Polis. He held the position of conservation director at the Turkish Cayman, I'm sorry, I can't say this. Can you please? Thank you very much. Excavation for the Middle Eastern Culture Center in Japan for 13 seasons. From 1986 to 1998, he ran a private practice in sculpture conservation. In 1998, his interest in public art led him to pursue a PhD at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London. His dissertation is titled Heritage Conservation as Culture Work, Public Negotiation of a Pacific Hero. He used the conservation of a monument of the first king of Hawaii to explore cultural relationships between the multicultural present and the native Hawaiian past. The research engaged local residents in researching power dynamics at play in the conservation process. He has served on professional committees for the American Institute for Conservation, the International Council of Museums Conservation Committee, Heritage Preservation, Independent Media Arts Preservation, the American Association of Museums, and the Western Association for Art Conservation. He served as WAAC president in 1991 and is currently on the AIC's publication committee. Dr. Wharton received his MA in art conservation from the Cooperstown Graduate Program, and we have Cooperstown people here, at the State University College of New York in 1981, and his PhD in conservation from the Institute of Archaeology in University College in 2005. Please welcome Glenn Wharton. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Janet. Well, after this morning's papers, I feel like throwing out the introduction that I had prepared. In fact, I think I will, much of it, because I wanted to lay the ground for sort of the more theoretical ground for the work that I did in the two case studies that I'm going to be talking about. What I'd rather do is give a short introduction, move to the case studies, and then maybe have a little more time for discussion at the end. With all of this discussion about new museology, opening up museum authority to stakeholders, the potential rise of stakeholders, I love that idea, is sort of a perfect setup for what I want to talk about, which is the sort of testing the waters of all of this in the field of conservation, which is very much about practice. So the practice of conservation, as you probably all know, has to do with shepherding objects, cultural objects, through time and place and protecting them. And it's very much about the object, whether it be a site or a building or a movable object in a museum collection. It's very focused on materiality, and that's one thing I would like to say at the beginning, this sort of inward focus of my profession of conservation makes it very difficult to open it up because of the way we're set up. Our code of ethics, our structures that we've developed as a field it's all about the object, all about understanding how it was made, what the materials are, how it's deteriorated. The idea of bringing the public into that discussion is not only difficult, but it's opposed. I've had a lot of opposition from colleagues from actually both of the case studies that I'll be talking about here. We can get into that a little bit later. And with that, I think I will just start with this first case study, which was the subject of my PhD dissertation in the end. It's a sculpture of King Kamehameha I in North Kohala, Hawaii, which is the big island of Hawaii. At the time, this was in the late 1990s when I was running a private practice in sculpture conservation in Southern California. The state of Hawaii was one of my primary clients. I would go there on a regular basis to perform examinations, surveys, and treatment of outdoor sculptures. And I had treated another Kamehameha sculpture in 1994, regilt it. And my one directive for this project from the state was, when you go out there, you'll see that it's been painted. Please figure out how to get the paint off so we can return it to its 19th century appearance. That's the one thing I knew about the sculpture. So I did travel to North Hawaii and saw the sculpture, compared it easily to the one that I had conserved in 1994, which is on your right, the one in Honolulu. They have a fascinating history, which I'll only very briefly tell you about. It was commissioned in the late 19th century to honor King Kamehameha and the centennial of the discovery of the Hawaiian Islands by Captain Cook. So very charged from the moment of commission, at a point where American businessmen were trying to take over Hawaii, political and economic structures. So it was proposed by the Hawaiian legislature and the present king to encourage a certain kind of nationalism among native Hawaiians. They contracted an American neoclassical artist living in Florence who had it cast in Paris. On the way from Paris to Hawaii, a fire broke out on the ship, sunk to the bottom of the ocean. With insurance money, they were able to commission a second one. Hence, they had two, because the first one was found by a fisherman, bought by a British ship captain, arrived in Hawaii at the same time as the second in 1883. So they installed the second one, which was in better condition, in front of the Justice Building in Honolulu, and the first one, which was in poor condition, because it had been at the bottom of the sea, at Kamehameha's birthplace, a small town on the Big Island. But nobody really knew the history. People I talked to said, well, it's always been painted. When I went out to this town and got up on a ladder, started to take paint samples, people came up to me and asked me, what are you doing? And I said, well, I've been sent here by the state to do a condition assessment. Some people said, well, whatever you do, don't take the paint off. And I said, why? And it's one woman, a shopkeeper from across the street, said, well, we paint him every year so we can relate to him as a human being. And I said, does everybody feel this way? And she said, everybody. I subsequently learned it's a divided we, as one would expect. But at any rate, there was this question in my mind, do we honor this long tradition now of repainting him on Kamehameha Day, which is a state holiday where there's a parade and offerings, or do I strip the paint off, honoring the artist's original intention, and gold leaf it? So in my proposal, I recommended that the state put together a project that would engage community in discussing whether they wanted it to be painted or gold leafed. The state said, absolutely not. You'd have no idea what you'd be getting into. You'd stir up all kinds of native Hawaiian issues. And besides, they don't understand art history. They don't understand that we have to honor the artist's intentions. So I thought about this a lot. I couldn't get it out of my mind, but in fact, the sculpture was deteriorated, so I got back to my, my primary physical responsibility of assessing its condition. So in fact, the paint was chipping off, there was bronze disease. Because of the shipwreck, there was some structural problems, so I put all that in the recommendation as well. And here's just a couple of shots from the parade on Kamehameha Day. The Hawaiian Studies students at sunrise drape leis over the figure that have been made and given by various community groups. Each group in the parade stops in front of the sculpture, makes an offering, children bring it up and put it on the base of the sculpture. So it's very much the center of cultural life in this small town. Since the state had told me not to do it, I just went back to my business, but couldn't get it out of my mind. And in the end, decided, I really want to explore this because there's something wrong with my profession and the way I do my work here, and I'm not quite sure what it is. I have a feeling an anthropologist would be able to sort some of this out to understand relationships between community and this cultural object, but I sure don't as a conservator. So I closed my business down, decided to pursue a PhD at the Institute of Archaeology in London, and with this as a potential case study. Fortunately, I was able to convince the state to allow me to do it. So I was then able to identify groups in the community, set up the structure, get some funding to do the kind of community-based project that I was evolving in my mind that would be modeled after public art projects and other projects that actively engage the community in mapping, meaning, and bringing contestation out to negotiate meaning and resolution. I wasn't sure where I'd go with this, but I went back to the community because I heard that a volunteer had repainted it. And I met with the volunteer, Kealoha Sugiyama, in front of the sculpture, that's him, and talked to him about the possibility of doing this work. And he told me that he wasn't sure that I was the right person to do it. I was an outsider, that the community probably wouldn't accept me, and that he didn't know whether Kamehameha would want me to be there. And I'm just going to read you a quote from this interview I had with him. This was back in 1996. And he's referring to the red on the sash that he had recently painted. It had always been yellow before. But in fact, the original feathered cloaks in the Bishop Museum do have red feathers in the central part of the sash. I stood in front of Kamehameha and I was dialoguing with the statue that I was going to paint it. And lo and behold, I was across the street at the Bond Library. This happened 5 times in a row. I looked at this one book and showed it to Kamehameha and said, "Is this what you want me to know?" And I wasn't sent back to the library, so I knew that if I was going to paint the statue, Kamehameha wanted me to paint him the right color. I took the picture to a group of kupuna at the Pu'ukohala Heiau, and I shared my story, and they agreed that it would be pono to paint the kihei red. And just this conversation made me realize that this was a really different world, a different way of understanding, or at least his way of understanding and relating to the sculpture was very different from mine. So I knew that if I was going to pursue this, I needed to be quite open and sensitive, and I also needed to work with community in a really substantive way. I couldn't just lay my project on them. So we spent a year and a half preparing the project. I identified, first of all, 3 community groups, Native Hawaiian community groups, and others that would be the representative groups in the community. So their leaders really developed the project on a local level. So I stood back. And throughout the project, this question of sharing professional authority and my role as the conservator kept coming up to me and to others. Like, you know, how far back should I stand? Do I just completely relinquish my authority, my understanding of materiality? Do I just turn it over to the community and say, okay, you tell me what you want, and then I do it? Or, so I was constantly asking myself, where do I fit in, where do they fit in as we negotiated this? I'll walk you through the project quickly. My primary research, my initial research, was archival to learn the history of the sculpture, material to learn how it was made, what had happened to it subsequently, and also just through conservation, I wanted to learn more, and through participatory work in the community. So I wondered, first of all, well, what's the model for this? This was a neoclassical sculpture, obviously, made in the late 19th century. So I started researching, and I didn't have to look far. The sculpture of Augustus Caesar, Prima Porta, had been excavated not too long before, a Roman sculpture, and the artist had clearly used it as a model. So this was King Kamehameha as a Roman emperor, standing in this classical stance at this moment where the Hawaiian legislature was trying to encourage Hawaiian nationalism. So in a sense, this Pacific hero, which they called it, was an attempt to say that Kamehameha was as good as a Roman emperor. So this is a very complex sculpture with a lot of cultural hybridity buried into it from the moment of commission and the design and the execution, and then as I learned throughout its history. Question of whether it had been painted at the beginning. I went to the state archives, read through all the letters, all of the documents. The artist had wanted to gold leaf it, but it wasn't clear whether he'd gotten the money to gold leaf it. And to make a very long story short, I did find some early photographs that to me looked like, at least by the turn of the 20th century, there was paint on it, even though they were black and white. Cross-section analysis, I found up to 25 layers of paint. Finally, at the bottom of some of the cross-sections, using X-ray diffraction, I did identify traces of gold. And then I went back, and in sort of the deep drapery folds with a little scalpel, I removed the paint, and I saw, in fact, gold leaf. I announced it to the community, and this was a shock, because nobody there actually thought that it had been gold leaf. So now we really had this question. It was originally gold leaf. Do we want it to be gold again, or do we want it to be painted? And we used that as that question as an opportunity for community to engage, discuss. And through a year and a half then of activities, I and others worked with the community to just, first of all, just get people talking about it. So we didn't have a situation where there was a rise of stakeholders at the beginning. Most people, of course, really didn't ever think about it. A lot of people didn't care in the community, but some people did. So as you might expect, there was a spectrum. I met with Hawaiian elders who said, we have a real difficulty in Hawaii getting the kupuna, the elders, to participate. They won't come out. We're in a post-plantation situation in which this generation wasn't allowed for many years to even come to public meetings, and they're not going to. And the only way you're going to get the elders involved is to get families involved. The only way you're going to get families involved is to get kids involved. So I spoke to over 500 kids, always with a Native Hawaiian representative who would often perform in chant and talk about the history. We contracted a hula instructor who's reviving puppet hula in Hawaii, who wrote a script about the history of the sculpture, and we put together workshops to make puppets out of coconuts and shells, and then presented this hula ki'i, which talked about the history of the sculpture in various public formats. We got grant money to engage art teachers, to get students involved in Kamehameha sculpture-related projects. This was a art class at the high school that created a mural of the Kamehameha sculpture under the sea. It was installed at the hospital. Another art class had students create works of art with the Kamehameha, known works of art with the Kamehameha sculpture inserted. We've got Japanese print and a Salvador Dali, a Warhol, and the death of Socrates. And this was We had community exhibitions. So little by little, people did start talking about this project and got engaged if they weren't before. This was, I think it was the Girl Scouts put together a panel of all the newspaper articles generated about the project. And on the bottom right, the debate club for the high school decided to have it as their topic for the year, whether to gold leaf or paint the sculpture. So they debated, and then elders were asked to speak about their relationship with the sculpture after this debate. So it was a big community event. Meanwhile, I had asked this committee to decide how to decide. So they discussed using traditional Hawaiian decision-making mechanisms. In the end, they decided to have a community vote. So they put together flyers, went to every single mailbox. They put up ballots all over the community, and people voted. They voted 71% to retain the paint. So this gave me then the answer I needed to move forward. By this time, many people were engaged in different ways in the project, and this was a Christian blessing accompanied by a Native Hawaiian blessing in which the Native Hawaiian representative chanted. So it was, again, sort of fused cultural activity. And then we started the work. And there were still a lot of decisions to be made, like, okay, paint, but what color of paint? And one of the things I learned about this project is that my role as the conservator gave me a certain entree. I wanted to do anthropological work. I interviewed 45 people, sometimes more than once, as I got to know them. I wanted to map relationships between people and the sculpture. I thought maybe at first different community groups would feel different ways, but they didn't. I wasn't able to do any of that kind of mapping. But it did give me the opportunity to ask questions that I wouldn't ordinarily be able to ask as a cultural researcher. For instance, the color of brown paint for his skin. I couldn't just come to a community like this and say, can we talk about skin color? But in fact, I had brown paint chips and wanted them to choose. So we got into discussions about the color of Hawaiian skin, the color of Kamehameha's skin, and how we wanted to represent it, and the committee had very different opinions. Also, we matched the yellow and red colors of the feathers by bringing in bird feathers from rare and extinct birds and matching the paint chips. And then the question of the eyes came up. I had interviewed Joe Chang, who was a maintenance coordinator who had been in charge of painting the sculpture for many years. He told me that in 1978, he went down to a hardware store and bought ball bearings from Poison spray cans, took them out, bronze ball bearings, and epoxied them into the eye sockets and painted them with pupils and highlights because he thought the hollow eye sockets didn't look good. Meanwhile, tourist literature always describes, if you walk in front of the sculpture, the eyes follow you. And so the fact that he had put them in was lost. No one knew this. But at any rate, since we did have to strip the paint off, I was worried they would come out. So I asked my associate on scaffolding, who was a Kamehameha descendant, to do the honor of the very first thing, removing the eyeballs. And so we keep them safely. So then the committee could decide whether to put them back or not after the treatment. And we did this, and there they are. And we had a meeting at the end of that very first day with this committee, who were the decision makers. And I said, by the way, at the end of the project, you'll need to decide whether you want me to put the eyeballs back or not. And the primary elder, Marie Solomon, who was on the committee, just looked at me and said, what? You removed Kamehameha's eyeballs? And she said, you know, and this was after a year and a half of me interviewing people about the sculpture, its importance, its spiritual, economic, political significance. She said, you know, call me superstitious, but for me, Kamehameha watches over our community through our eyes. And in the old days, when we would bury our ancestors, the I'i, the bones, would go into caves, and there would be shells put in a little Ki'i figure that allowed our ancestors to watch over us. And these eyes of Kamehameha are the same thing. And you've been in our community for a year and a half now, and we've learned to trust you, and you tell me now you've taken his eyes out. I don't know what this means for the future of Kohala. So I was ready to pack up and go. I mean, unfortunately, other Native Hawaiians on the committee did say, no, Glenn had to take them out. They were put in by Joe Chang, and so they're really not Kamehameha's eyes. And then finally, she just started to laugh. This was totally surreal. And this is all captured on film, because by this time we're doing a documentary film of the project. But I think we all realized we were in a situation of uncharted territory. It wasn't a matter of asking the elders how to care for this thing, because this thing was made in European materials and technology with a lot of Europeanist ideas embedded of the most important Native Hawaiian chief at his birthplace. So it was very confused. There was no right and wrong answer, but it provided really good opportunity for cultural research and community discussion. At any rate, we proceeded to treat the sculpture, strip the paint off. That's it on the right after the paint is removed, and a lot more of the detail in the bronze was visible. During the whole project, community groups kept coming, and Nalani Carrera, the Kamehameha descendant, would often come down, because he was a hula instructor, and sort of dance the history of the sculpture to various groups that would come. And then in the repainting, this is Kealoha Sugiyama. I allowed him to at least start the repainting of the red. And I used industrial paints as opposed to house paints. No one had a problem with that, that would protect it from UV radiation. And then at the end of the project, the Royal Order of Kamehameha rededicated the monument. There was a big ceremony on Kamehameha Day, and Nalani and his sister gave a hula offering to Kamehameha and the project. So I've abbreviated a lot here for the sake of brevity, but you know, I wondered then a lot about, you know, how did the project affect the community? What did I learn from my practice as a conservator? What lessons could be learned? I did go back a year later, interviewed 10 key people, and asked them, you know, what they thought about the project. I certainly think that from my point of view, I learned or developed a model for participatory conservation that could be transferred probably to other situations. I learned that as a conservator, I have a certain entree that an anthropologist might not. That can be of some utility for research. But the community itself, I talked to them, and you know, by a year later, it was off the minds of a lot of people, but some people said that they really were impacted. And I do have a quote here from one woman that I spoke with. She said that, for many, I think they took it for granted that the statue was here and it would always be here. But to ask the question about painting or gilding it, all of a sudden people had an opinion. You get dialogue from them. And those who always had a bond with the statue found themselves even thinking more about Kamehameha. Then you start going back to his life, his purpose, and what was he trying to do with his people. They went to another level. They started searching themselves. So at least for some, this had an effect, and it offered a model of public participation that they hadn't had before. So now just very briefly, Janet, remind me what time I need to stop, because I want to have a lot of time for discussion here. Okay. Okay, good. Now for something entirely different. When Janet first asked me to talk about these two different sort of life projects, I've never done this before at the same podium, but in fact, they have to do with opening my conservation practice to non-professional stakeholders in very different ways. So maybe we can make some ties. I'm now working at the Museum of Modern Art, putting together a program for the conservation of time-based media. We have about 2,000 works that are video, electronic, and performance, ranging from this very complex installation by Pipolati Riest that we commissioned last year, then acquired, with video projections and interaction with people in the gallery, to more of a sculptural work by Bruce Nauman with 2 looping videotapes on CRT monitors. And, you know, I get involved with artists, not the public, which is maybe something we can talk about, but increasingly I perform interviews with them to learn about the history of the technology, the current technology, their thoughts about how to install and represent the work. Then we talk about the future. What kind of variability in the installation are they assigning to the museum? And often they've never thought about this. Or can I digitize the analog video? In this case, Bruce Nauman was loaned to the Venice Biennale last summer, and he wanted me to digitize the analog tapes. So in other words, really change the technology. And there was some discussion about showing them on flat panel screens on a wall, as opposed to the sculptural representation. I had some real issues with this, but because the artist was there, because the curator was there, we decided that it could be shown that way. In the end, it wasn't, but we decided, yes, it could be shown this way and still be called the same work of art. But I have some major reservations about this. As of last year, we're now acquiring live performances. So not just the documentation, but the rights to perform a work of art. So the artist is assigning MoMA the rights to train new performers to represent older performances. And so the documentation that I get involved in is not only the artist's interviews, but actually videotaping the artist training performers and then videotaping the performance itself. A few months ago, there was a Roman Ondak installation that we just acquired at MoMA, Measuring the Universe, in which he trained performers to measure the height of museum visitors on the wall, and they would just write their name and the date. And by the end of the exhibition, there was essentially a black line around the wall. So we made basically a training video of how someone in the future could train new performers and install the work. It gets a little more complicated with technology. This is a work, I don't have time to explain the whole thing, but it's a biographical work of Jennifer and Kevin McCoy, Our Second Date, in which they went on a second date when they were film students and saw Godard's Le Week-end in Paris. And on this turntable is a depiction of a traffic accident from the film with live feed cameras shooting the little figures on the turntables that goes around, projecting them on the walls, but also Kevin and Jennifer are actually sitting on this table, little plasticine models, watching Le Week-end, and so cameras are shooting them as well. Very, very complex technology, but you can see here on the upper right, there's Kevin and Jennifer. You know, you see them in the front, and then you see them in the back watching the film. So the interview with them was about not only their technology, but, you know, and there was audio too. How loud do you want it to be? What are the light levels? What do we have to replace the live feed cameras and so on? Fortunately, they provide a lot of documentation. And I'm thinking of my work now is really about documentation. So they provide a lot of really good documentation about the electronics, the circuitry, installation guidelines, but there's still a lot of gray areas where an interview can help fill in. That's them on the right, with Barbara London in the middle, a curator I work with, and two students on the left. Since I teach, I increasingly teach about this in my seminars, and we use case studies from MoMA's collection to research, and then often the students will actually perform the interviews. And that's what's happening here with John F. Simon with his little laptop piece. But we do get into, interestingly enough, you know, Heather Hope Stevens' presentation about Vera, I found very interesting. I actually didn't know that museums were asking artists to waive their rights of integrity. That surprises me. I guess I'm just ignorant. Now I want to know if MoMA's doing that. But it sort of doesn't apply to the work I'm doing, because as Heather Hope said, electronic art, video art, and actually performance art is excluded. So, but we do have contracts. We bend over backwards, I think, to try to get the artist's concerns. But there is conflict. In this case, with computer-based art, for me, I think the ultimate way to conserve a piece is to get the code from the artist, because we know that we're not going to be able to run these works on the same equipment, nor even the same software or operating systems. But somehow, some artists are resistant to, like, they'll give you everything but the code. So I'm now working with our lawyer to develop a mechanism where we could maybe hold the code in trust, or get the code, but then not allow or not do anything with it unless the artist can't be contacted. So there are whole new issues that I would have never dreamed of before. And I think I will show this, because this is sort of the ultimate for me of complex art that requires negotiation and a lot of sort of thinking, sometimes for the first time with artists. I'm going to show you a little video clip. These are the artists talking about this work that I'm going to say something about.
Also the search for self.
Every few hours, we pull data from online dating sites all over the world. We put these dating profiles in a database. We do several different movements, and each of these movements explores a different topic. One movement explores who people are, and that's called Who I Am. One movement explores what people are looking for, that's called What I Want. And we allow people to search through them by saying, I'm interested in what women in their 20s are like. I want to see what men in their 60s are looking for. So the blue balloons are men, and the pink balloons are women, and the darker balloons are older people, and the lighter balloons are younger people.
Whereas all the other movements are very, very chaotic, with all of these balloons creating around the screen. Matchmaker offers finally some resolution. So in Matchmaker, we algorithmically pair people together based on what they say in their profile. So the next movement is called snippets, and it actually consists of 3 smaller movements. Snippets takes little text snippets from people's dating profiles out of context. In this case, this is called opener, and this is showing the opening lines from people in their dating profile.
This particular movement is the closing statements of all the profiles. And this movement is the movement that you can see the silhouette set. So each of these are a silhouetted person, and they represent people trapped inside the balloon looking for love.
Tagline is going to take the text snippet that is the subject line of people's profile and then put them all in this DNA double helix here, which is kind of the symbol of identity.
So one thing that's interesting with these is you see half of these are men, half of these are women, and this represents the population on dating profiles.
what we do is we then say, what are some ideas about the population in general, or what are some information about the population in general? So for example, what are the top first dates? A lot of people like to go to coffee. A lot of people like to go to a movie.
One of my dating profiles that people do is they talk about themselves in maybe 200 words, and they say the most important things about themselves. And so it's a very fertile ground for building a mosaic of humanity.
Okay, enough of that. So, this is a very complex work, and it's just an example. This was commissioned, and then I learned later that we acquired it. I'm trying to get on top of this now at MoMA to learn from the curators when we're going to commission something, so I can talk to the artists beforehand and start getting the right technology so that we can keep it alive. Just very briefly, I did interview these artists. They wrote a Java crawler to harvest data from 20 different dating websites. One of the artists is in Palo Alto. He manages the database. We don't have the data at MoMA. The other artist wrote the code in C++ language to import this data to a computer and run it that's on the back of this touchscreen that goes on the wall. And he said that the code is totally buggy. It's the first time he's ever written anything in C++. And this is a conservation nightmare. You know, when I learned that we don't even have the code, we don't have the code, it's totally buggy, and we don't have the data, it's managed by somebody in Palo Alto. So I asked the artists, well, you know, I might want to take this as a case study and think through what it would really mean to conserve this work. And we just got a grant at NYU to form a conservation of computer-based art working group. So we're getting together computer scientists, museum studies people, art historians, conservators, hopefully some anthropologists and sociologists to really think about this complex kind of art in museums and what it means to move it forward on both a technical and non-technical basis. And the artists are willing, so I think we will be working with them and maybe a few other case studies in the future. But I put this in because I was thinking about, you know, expanding representation and conservation. It's not just about communities as I worked with in Hawaii, but in my current work, it's about other professionals, academics, students, as well as my colleagues at the museum. We formed a media art working group, so I meet regularly with the curators, registrar, AV team, and IT team. So I'm working in ways that I never did before as a traditional sculpture conservator. And I think that there is a parallel here. I would love to develop models for engaging community at MoMA, sort of looking for that, and I'd love to work with the education department maybe. Just wanted to leave you with another thought that what we're doing at MoMA isn't the only, you know, sort of place where this is happening. It's happening around the world where museums are acquiring contemporary art that's ephemeral or new technologies. A lot of the research we do doesn't get published. So a whole new form of sharing has evolved through this group, the International Network for the Conservation of Contemporary Art. They have an artist's archive database where people researching works of contemporary art can enter abstracts of their unpublished research onto this database. Then other INCA members can go to the database and contact me if I'm a contributor and ask if they can have a report. So this is just beginning, but it's a way to share among the professional community between institutions for work that doesn't get published. So that's a whole other way to think about sharing. Just want to maybe conclude by saying that I'm not sure that this is a neat presentation, but I think that there, you know, it's part of a larger movement. You know, in museums to bring in publics, to open old sort of traditional channels of authority to other non-professional participants. And I think it's a very healthy thing, but we also have to think very carefully about what we're doing. I have to think about it all the time with my practice as a conservator. Like I said, I sort of lost myself in Hawaii at a certain point. I just thought, why am I even here, you know? Maybe I should have just raised the question and left. And then I remembered, well, no, actually, I do know about metal corrosion. I know about gold leafing. I know about industrial paints and UV inhibitors. And I do know stuff. So I'm a participant in this. And so I then refound myself. And here at the museum, we're not just giving authority over to the artists to say, what do you want? What do, you know? But we are bringing them in a meaningful way. And you know, I don't know of any situation where relationships between conservators and contemporary artists has come to litigation over issues of artist intent. There probably are some, actually, well, there are some, but not within the realm that I'm talking about. So I think these laws are going to be tested in courts. I do think that our contracts, our legal agreements are very important. But in fact, from what I experience, people are bending over backwards to try to bring the artist in and learn from them what the work of art can be in the future as it varies. So with that, I think I'll just open it up to questions and love to talk more about theory or practice if anyone has any. Yep. Oh, do you want people to come to the mic?
Hi, Josh Gorman. The Kamehameha project, who paints them now?
It hasn't been repainted. Fortunately, it hasn't needed it. But the state not only refused to have anything to do with the project, they authorized it, and they authorized another commission to be the head of the project rather than the Art and Public Places division. But they refused to take care of it. They do expend funds to take care of the second sculpture in Honolulu, but not the first. And so people in the community are now rising, the stakeholders, but they've campaigned, they've written letters to the Art and Public Places division, and they're just meeting total resistance. So they're thinking of creating a little nonprofit or something, doing some fundraising so they can collect maintenance funds. I've gone over a couple times to sort of on a volunteer basis to check it, and it's still okay, but there's no funding in place. Yep.
I was very interested in hearing about both of those projects, but particularly the one in Hawaii and what you just mentioned about how the state does not fund it. Is that because the decision ultimately went against what they had wanted to do from the beginning?
They didn't support the project from the beginning, but when I got the potential of a grant from a national organization to do the project with interest from PBS to doing a documentary film, they were sort of pressured into saying, okay, fine, do it, but not, you know, through our authority. What they said was that this was commissioned by the Royal Hawaiian government prior to Hawaii, becoming a state in the country, and certainly prior to their formation in 1967, I think. So it doesn't fall within the jurisdiction of the Art and Public Places division because they didn't commission it. And since it wasn't even commissioned during the time that Hawaii was a state, it's not owned by anyone. And so it's not anyone's responsibility to take care of it. Even though this was the very first bronze sculpture in Hawaii and a monument, and the first of now 4 Kamehameha monuments. So.
And I just had a second question, and I was just wondering, after the community involvement in that project, you had said initially that there were some stakeholders who were involved with the project, but it wasn't sort of on on a wide scale. After the finish or completion of that project, has the community now sort of stepped up and really sort of, are they basically the ones that are really the ones that are responsible for upholding that project now as a result of what happened and this sort of community engagement that came about from that project?
Yeah, there's a committee, the committee that we formed to manage the project locally was disbanded, but it fell on the Kamehameha Day Celebration Committee, which organizes the celebrations every year to conduct the maintenance of the monument. So I did train a group there, and we videotaped the training session to put up scaffolding and wash it down with water and a neutral detergent, and document it with photographs, and keep a binder, and let me know anyway if they see anything. So they do every once in a while. So that is in place, but I would say it's very fragile. It's depending on a group of volunteers and their interests. There's no money involved. Yep, Carlo.
I have to know if you put back the eyes.
We did put the eyes back, and I did lay on the top plank of the scaffolding upside down and painted it and make sure I didn't paint it cross-eyed so that it was actually looking down. So I think I did a good job, but the eyes are back.
Thank you so much for your very sort of professional, reflexive talk. I'm very interested in the second project because sort of ethics of conservation or training conservation specialists is one of our priorities at the Rijnwaard Academy as well, talking about the Rijnwaard again, sorry. And you were talking about that with this conceptual art, it's very much about preserving the process. And you showed this website, and you were saying this website is sort of based on case studies, and professionals can learn from each other and have this sort of reflexive mode there. And then you said, is it possible to also include the public or the other or the non-professional? Is that a possibility that this website can be open for the public as well, so that you sort of open up the discourse of who's a professional and who isn't? Or is it still very much sort of an internal communication site? And have you thought about engaging the public more in your process, sort of at the museum as well? Because I think that would be talking about what is being an ethical professional is very much opening up your doors and letting people be part of your professional process. So that, have you thought about that?
Well, I'll answer the second part first. MoMA just did start a blog, and so the conservators can now contribute to the blog. It's really not open, though. It doesn't go back and forth, but people can comment, but I don't think it's meant to be the kind of blog where community input, really discusses decision-making at MoMA. So maybe we've opened a little door there. I would love to work with the education department on some project that would really engage community. To be honest, in some ways I think my mind isn't creative enough. I'm not sure how the public could weigh in a meaningful way in the kinds of research and decision-making I'm doing. So if anybody has some ideas, let me know. I'd love to move in this direction. But I don't think we're there yet at MoMA, and I don't know. The Indianapolis Museum of Art is actually doing some really interesting work, and there are other museums that are starting to engage the public in the conservation process. So there's that. The first thing you mentioned, I'd like to say that the most interesting theoretical and practical work in conservation of contemporary art right now is all going on in Europe. There's little pockets of it here in the US, and much of it is in the Netherlands. The Dutch government has supported the European initiative to create INCA, the International Network for the Conservation of Contemporary Art. So the headquarters is actually in Amsterdam. Through the ICN, that's right. So I go over to Amsterdam all the time. I'm going over there in a few weeks, in fact.
Oh, that's good.
But so we look to Europe to lead us in a lot of these endeavors. The database itself, we've discussed this a lot, right now is only open to members. Membership of INCA is free, but you have to contribute to the database to maintain your membership. So if you're not in a position of collecting information in order to post it on the database, you're really excluded from access. And then you get into questions of rights. Like if I interview one of these artists and I post the transcript on the database, first of all, I need to get permission from the artist, from my museum, but then, you know, do I really have the permission to share it with the public, like a library? Or is it was originally conceived of as a cross-professional sharing. So registrars, curators, conservators, and others are very much encouraged. We're starting an organization in North America, and I really want artists and collectors to be in the mix as well. So we're moving in that direction.
That's good to hear. And what I liked is that you sort of question or search for new definition on what is authenticity, especially with the conceptual work you showed. So very interesting. And it's good to hear that you're coming, because then we could ask you to come and give a lecture with us.
Well, we'll talk about that. Other questions? Yes.
I'm Steve Lubar. I've got a question. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that the code of ethics of conservators, in fact, discourages this kind of thing. And I remember working with conservators, that code of ethics could trump almost anything else that a museum might want to do in many ways. I'm sorry, our code of ethics insists that, whatever. Is that likely to change? Are you thinking about how that code of ethics might change?
I had a very hard time publishing the Kamehameha Project in our professional journal. The reviewers said that it was not conservation work, that it shouldn't be published. I, last week, had a conversation with a conservator at the Met who said we should not be including artist intent in our deliberations. I think our field has a long way to go. I'm constantly surprised because I like to think we're all in the same place, but we're not. And you know, this conservator is a conservator of medieval and Renaissance sculpture. And we actually then got into a conversation, and he said, you know, the question of artist intent really doesn't come up in my work. I work with curators, art historians, to figure out what the artist probably intended so we can make aesthetic decisions about representation. So he's working in a very tight professional world. And I said, what about installation art? What about for work that is installed and then you throw it away afterwards, but you've acquired it? So how's a museum supposed to know how to reinstall it if you don't interview the artist and get that information? And I could just see a light bulb go on in his head. And he said, you know, you're right. I've never really thought about that. So I think, you know, a lot of discussion and communication needs to go on. I also know what it takes to revise a code of ethics professionally with committees and years of deliberation, and we may get there, but right now, well, there have been changes in the code, so it is much more open now. So that conservators are not guided to determining the universal value of an object in order to make their decision. There's a certain kind of relativism creeping into our profession, or this recognition that an object can mean more than one thing to different people over time and place, and that we need to take that into consideration. But we've got a long way to go.
Thanks. I'm Pete Brown from Manchester in England. I'm interested in your role and how you describe it, because both of those projects, particularly the first one, seem to contain a lot of emotion. And I wondered whether you saw your role as a kind of technical role, because you talked about how far you stand back, or whether you had feelings either way.
I think that just like everything else, my role is contingent on the work of art, the situation, the other stakeholders, if we want to call them that. So I try to be very careful about asserting myself. And really, with my work at MoMA right now, the borders of our professional responsibilities are becoming so diffuse that I'm doing the same work as the registrar. She's doing the same work as me, and the curators. I mean, we each have our own position, you know, our professional position, but it's really sort of bleeding at the borders in a very healthy way, I think, because of the demands of the art. But, you know, my vision or my view as a conservator with installation art, with time-based media art, is a focus on the past, the technical past, the construction of the work, and a focus on the future. What can it be in the future as we modify the technology, as we reinstall it in a round room, in a rectangular room, and the art sort of becomes itself through time, through each instantiation. So, you know, I find myself looking at the past and the future, whereas the curator is interested in acquiring it, exhibiting it, the registrar is more interested in tracking it, cataloging, getting, you know, the information on the collections management database. So just within the museum, we each have our own roles, but we're really working together. So does that partially answer your question, or? Kind of, but I think you're doing yourself a disservice by saying that you haven't got a very creative mind. I think you certainly have. And we're human beings, and we're going to respond to each other within those situations. So I wondered how far you got drawn in, because you talked about standing back. I got the impression that you might have got drawn into that project more than maybe you, as a conservator, you might technically be. I was very drawn into the Kamehameha project. I remember I was at Stanford at a certain point, and I spoke with Ian Hodder, who's an archaeologist there, who writes a lot about construction of memory and participation and in the archaeological process. And I told him, you know, I just learned that the sculpture was commissioned to honor the discovery of the Hawaiian Islands by Captain Cook. And no one that I've interviewed in this community said anything about that. Should I, like, tell them? And, I mean, what is my role here? I'm a researcher and a conservator. And he said, absolutely. He said it would be wrong to, you know, not to disclose anything that you learn, but do it in a way and at a time in an appropriate fashion. And so my decision on that one was, yes, I'm not going to announce it at a community meeting, but I would tell people as it came up in conversation. So I was constantly negotiating my role, and yeah, I mean, I became very close with a lot of the people in this community, and still am. So it was very emotional.
One thing that that does tie both of your cases together in an interesting way is with regard to what sort of, I've noticed that museums are more and more trying to grapple with this issue of the conservation and safeguarding of the intangible heritage. And you know, when you think about the meanings, the cultural meanings surrounding the Kamehameha statue, on one hand, that's sort of more overtly one kind of intangible heritage, but when you were talking about MoMA's efforts towards not only purchasing the rights to perform certain things, but then having the video record of teaching the performances and how to do it, and like the descriptions on how to install the digital installations, et cetera, there seems to be maybe a really interesting role. Well, first of all, an interesting learning experience that can be gained from the sort of the meta, right? The meta information about the installation process, about the performances, how to do them, et cetera. That might, in fact, be, you know, that's happening within sort of contemporary art. That might, in fact, be really useful to discussing how to confront longer term, larger issues regarding the intangible heritage, even with dealing with older objects, items of folklore or whatever, is that really trying to archive and some sort of meta archive, right? What is it that people are feeling or communities are thinking, or how do you interact with this given thing, this given practice or performance, and using that in a way to safeguard the intangible heritage, which is, again, a very sort of hard to pin down kind of thing for a museum, which is, as you said early on, is so focused on materiality to deal with.
Very interesting. I think you've got something there, that maybe there is potential for abstracting this out and learning from what's going on in contemporary art museums and cultural sites, archaeological sites, and the conservation of folk practice, oral history. I think they are all tied together, and I think some kind of meta project to abstract that out and look for similarities could be a really interesting project. At the beginning, I thought what you were going to say was, we need to share that with the public. And the problem with that is that a lot of artists and a lot of museums don't want to disclose the mystery behind the art. I'm all about the materiality. I just think that's, for me, often that's what's interesting about the art. It's like, how does that computer program work? But that's not what the artists want the public to experience necessarily. So some of the artists that I interview tell me,
sometimes communities with sacred knowledge and things like that. In fact,
like
so I mean, I think there's a parallel to be drawn there as well.
It's sacred knowledge. And so they tell me, look, I'm going to tell you this because I realize you're responsible for it, and I want MoMA to have this information, but I don't want you to make this public. I want the public to experience a touch screen with pink and blue balloons exploding and have an emotional, physical interactive response. Not that those artists said that, I'm using that as an example, but so there's another dimension with fine arts and living artists.